Let's call this going on.
Rangers, lead the way!
Gear.
Man, making the rest of us look...
Whatever that thing is. You got it. So. Be shitting me. You're one of them.
Rangers on the...
Let us in more. Warning. Cross it. Push to the limit. No comms.
The first light of dawn fell like a thin sheet of gray over the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, and the hum of rotors was the only sound that cut through the cold. A four-man U.S. Army squad was hunkered down in a shallow ditch that had once been an irrigation channel, the sand and dust still clinging to their fatigues. The men had been in the valley for weeks, moving from village to village, checking checkpoints, and watching the horizon for any sign of insurgent activity. Private First Class Malik Rafi, the youngest of the two brothers in the squad, was wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, when his older brother, Sergeant First Class Jonah Rafi, let out a low, conspiratorial laugh. "You know why they pulled me out here, right?" Jonah said, the sarcasm clear in his voice. "Because of that full-blown," he paused, letting the word hang, "and the fact that the higher-ups think I'm still useful." Malik shot back quickly. "Who just called me a—" The two exchanged a rapid volley of teasing barbs, the kind of ribbing that only siblings could sustain after years of shared childhood squabbles and now shared danger. No one else in the squad could tell if the tension was real or merely a joke meant to keep the nerves from fraying. Jonah, eyes still scanning, the ridgeline leaned back onto his elbow and, without missing a beat, launched into an impromptu physics lecture. "Listen, kiddo, the first law of thermodynamics. Energy can't be created or destroyed. It just moves somewhere else. Think about that truck we're hauling. If we block the vents, the heat can't escape. Pressure builds and eventually the radiator's going to blow." Malik frowned, half amused, half worried. "We're not supposed to be tinkering with the trucks, bro. We should be on the front lines, not playing handyman." "Yeah, the Ranger Assessment Selection Program, RASP, starts in June," Malik added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You said you weren't interested, that you're too old for the Rangers. Hardcore, they say." Jonah's smile faded a fraction. "I'm not the kid you were when you first enlisted. I've seen enough to know that the Rangers aren't a club you join on a whim. You're still green, kid. You'll have to earn it." Malik stared at his brother, the heat of the Afghan sun making the metal of the rifle he held feel like a pancake. "We promised each other we'd do it together, right? You and me, like we always said." There was a beat of silence, broken only by the distant howl of a wind gust. Jonah thought the weight of his older brother's request and the memory of their childhood promise. Two boys on a cracked sidewalk swearing they'd always have each other's backs, settled like a stone in his chest. He sighed, gave a reluctant nod, and said, "All right, I'm in." The conversation was cut short by a guttural roar of gunfire that split the morning. An ambush erupted from the ridgeline. RPGs screamed past and the earth shook with each explosion. The squad scattered, silhouettes flickering like shadows in a brutal dance of light and death. A shrapnel blast slammed into Jonah's helmet, sending him spiraling into the dusty ground. His vision went black, the world narrowing to the sound of his own breathing. When his eyes finally cleared, the scene was a nightmare frozen in time. Bodies, friend and foe alike, were tangled in the sand. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and blood. Malik was there, crawling over broken rifles, his face smeared with grime, eyes wide with terror. "Jonah, you're alive!" he shouted, gripping his brother's armor strap as if he might slip away again. Jonah's mind, however, did not immediately recognize the present. The last thing he remembered was the sound of his own rifle being knocked from his hands 2 years earlier, the screams of his squad, and an explosion that had torn a slab of earth from the ground. In that instant, he was back in the desert of his memories, the night of the ambush that had taken his best friend, the night he had dragged his own brother 10 miles across the rock-scarred terrain to the nearest outpost on a broken shin. 2 years later, the RSP base in Fort Benning, was a world away from the dust and heat of Afghanistan. The walls were lined with rows of camouflage-painted trucks and a wall of mirrors that reflected the faces of men who had voluntarily chosen a path that would test every fiber of their being. Jonah stood among them, now a seasoned E6, his hair flecked with gray at the temples, his face bearing the faint lines of a man who had seen too much. Each applicant was handed a small, laminated card bearing a single number. Jonah's was 81. He had applied 4 times, each time brushing close to the age cutoff, each time fighting the lingering doubts that his one-time career aspirations were now just a ghost of a younger man's dream. The first sergeant, a hulking figure with a voice that could shatter glass, addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to embark on 8 weeks of the toughest selection program in the world. Your emotional, physical, and mental thresholds will be tested beyond anything you have ever known. If, by the grace of God, you survive to the final stage, you will face a 24-hour simulated mission, a death march, and if you cross that line, you will be eligible for the most storied regiment in the United States Army. The words hit the assembled men like a hammer. In the weeks that followed, the men ran grueling obstacle courses that seemed designed by a cruel architect. They lifted logs that weighed as much as a small car, and they were periodically told to pack up and return home. As each group of non-selects walked out of the gates, the remaining candidates felt the weight of loss settle upon their shoulders like a lead blanket. The rifles they carried were loaded with blanks. In a training yard, they practiced hand-to-hand combat, each strike echoing the desperation of a life-or-death encounter. Where most men grinned, joked, or tried to forge bonds over late-night meals, Jonah ate alone. He refused to speak much, his mind locked away behind a steel door. During a break between drills, a fellow candidate, Private First Class Seamus 7 O'Leary, caught a glimpse of the faint bronze tattoo on Jonah's forearm. A simple set of letters, DFQ, etched into his skin. 7, ever curious, tried to decipher its meaning. He later learned it stood for "Do for Quiet," the motto his older brother had given him to remind him that in battle sometimes the greatest act of bravery was to protect the silence that followed the storm, the pressure of the program, built toward its climax. On a humid afternoon, the candidates were led into a massive pool, their boots clanking against the tiled floor, each of them assigned a weight on their backs. The exercise required them to walk along the bottom, breath-holding as they carried the load. As Jonah descended, the memory of his brother's broken leg, the way both of them had stumbled across the shattered sands of a canyon, flooded his mind. He saw within the pool's dimly lit water, his own shoes slipping on the slick concrete as he hauled his brother's limp body across the unforgiving terrain. The vision was too much. Jonah's eyes rolled back, his body convulsed, and he was pulled up, gasping, his lungs filled with the cold, chlorinated water that hissed as it escaped. A medic slammed his hands on Jonah's back, draining his lungs, and the sergeant major of the course, an older man with a scarred face and a voice that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 battles, called Jonah into his cramped office. "Sergeant," the sergeant major began, his tone even. "You have not failed any of the physical events. You have not dropped a single obstacle. But this program is not only about how much weight you can lift or how fast you can run. It is about how you function in a team, how you lead, how you recover from trauma. You refuse to sleep. You isolate yourself. You dodge every chance to be a leader. You have applied to RASP every week since the day you got discharged from your last assignment. You are driven, but the mental component is failing." Jonah opened his mouth, but only a hoarse rasp escaped. "All I need is to cross that finish line. That's all it takes." The sergeant major shook his head. "You are one of the most capable candidates I have ever seen, Sergeant. But if you cannot function as a part of a unit, if you cannot share the burden, you will do more harm than good to the regiment." The silence stretched. Jonah clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palm. The room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat. He didn't leave. He stayed. And weeks later, he still stood among the last handful of candidates, his number 81 marked on his chest. The final mission brief was delivered in a cramped tactical room, a single overhead bulb flickering above a metal table, a lone VHF radio perched on its edge. The rifles were fitted with blank firing adapters. The candidates could not fire live rounds, only the sound of gunfire. The sergeant turned to Jonah, now appointed team leader for the first time, a role previously held by the ever-optimistic Seamus Seven O'Leary. The Yarko announcement was categorical. You will be dropped into jungle terrain. There is a crashed helicopter at grid 14 to 2345. Its equipment must be destroyed. A pilot has been taken hostage in a nearby village. You are to locate, rescue, and extract the pilot. You have 23 hours and 59 minutes to complete the operation and return to the extraction point. If you fail, the mission is compromised. The men exchanged glances, the weight of the order settling like a stone in their stomachs. Seven stepped forward, his voice steady. We've trained for this. We'll move as one, watch each other's backs, we'll make it. He delivered a brief, sincere speech that seemed to cut through the tension like a blade, and the team, for the first time since the beginning of the course, stood together. The chopper screamed overhead, its rotors sweeping a gust of wind that whistled through the trees as the candidates were hurled out into a dense, humid jungle. The canopy above clouded the sunlight, turning the world to a perpetual twilight. Mosquitoes swarmed like black clouds, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and rot. Jonah assigned watches, allocating 20-minute rotations for the men to rest while the rest stood alert. During one of these watches, while the men huddled beneath a large fern, Seven approached Jonah, his eyes searching. You ever think about going back? About why we're doing this? He asked, his voice barely audible over the cicadas. Jonah stared into the tangled foliage, his mind a battlefield of past and present. I'm here because I promised a promise, he replied. I'm here because I need to finish what I started. That's all that matters. The night was interrupted by a high-pitched whine that cut through the jungle, a sound that could have been artillery, a distant aircraft, or perhaps a lone predator. Jonah barked an order. Move! Stay low! The team surged forward, slipping through the underbrush, eyes scanning for any movement. By the first light of dawn, they reached a river that cut a serpentine path through the jungle. An old, wrecked helicopter lay half-submerged at its bank, twisted metal protruding like a broken spine. Behind it, a thatch-covered village clung to the opposite shore, smoke curling from a few huts. Jonah's mind raced. He knew the enemy would try to set fire to the aircraft to smoke them out, that the hostage would be guarded, that the village would be hostile. He called for a sitrep, but the VHF radio sputtered, static gnawing at the transmission. One of the men, Private First Class 57, shouted that the coordinates from the briefing were off by a few hundred meters, and the interference suggested something or someone was jamming their signal. The team moved cautiously, toward the wreckage. Jonah slipped away from the group, drawn by a flash of metal reflected in the shallow water, something that gleamed like a knife. He crawled alone, driven by an instinct he could not explain. And there, partially buried under the mud, lay a satellite dish, its dish pointing skyward like a silent sentinel. He realized this was a listening post, a trap set to feed false intel to the enemy. Back with the main group, they placed improvised charges from the supplies in their packs onto the helicopter's fuselage. The blast was small but sufficient to ensure the wreck could not be salvaged. As the black smoke rose, Jonah returned, his face streaked with mud, his eyes narrowed. You saw the dish? Seven asked, his voice hoarse. Jonah nodded. It was a setup. They're feeding us false data. The real target is the village, and we need to get the pilot and get out before they know we're here. The team altered course, moving silently through the undergrowth toward the village. They breached a small hut only to find the pilot, alive, bruised, but breathing, crouched behind a broken wall, his eyes wide with terror. The man whispered a thank you before Jonah wrapped a tactical sling around his shoulders. As they turned to retreat, a volley of gunfire erupted from the village perimeter. The enemy, now aware of the intrusion, launched a barrage of small arms fire. Jonah shouted, "Run! Keep moving!" The men surged forward, weaving through the trees, their blank rifles echoing with simulated gunfire, the real danger only in the sharp cracks of actual weapons. They reached the extraction point just as twilight fell, the river a dark ribbon beneath a sky bruised with amber. The helicopter waiting above was a shadow against the dimming light. Jonah, his breath ragged, placed the rescued pilot into the aircraft. Seven placed his hand on Jonah's shoulder, his voice firm. You led us, brother. The rotor blades spun, pushing a gust of wind that lifted the helicopter into the night. As they lifted away, the jungle below receded, the sounds of the battle fading into a distant roar. Jonah stared at the dwindling canopy, the memory of his brother's limp form, the sound of the radiator's burst in Afghanistan, and the fatigue etched into every bone of his body. When they finally touched down on the training field, the men were met with cheers and the distant clang of a metal door closing. The sergeant major approached Jonah, a rare smile breaking his grim facade. "You made it," he said, voice low enough that only Jonah could hear. "You led them, you faced your demons, and you didn't lose yourself in the process. This isn't just a badge you earned, it's a testament to the promise you kept." Jonah nodded, feeling the weight of his number, 81, glinting on his breast as the sun rose over the horizon. The journey that began with a sarcastic quip in a dusty Afghan ditch had come full circle. He had survived the ambush, carried his brother's memory across miles of broken terrain, walked through the fire of selection, and finally led a team through a jungle that echoed his own inner wildness. As the day warmed, the men gathered around a makeshift fire, passing a battered canteen among them. Jonah sat back watching the flames lick the night sky, his heart finally at rest. He had kept his promise, not just to his brother, but to himself. And in the quiet crackle of the fire, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that the road ahead, no matter how steep, was now his to walk, with his comrades beside him, and the promise of his past forever guiding his stride. The helicopter that had been sent on the mission circled low over the ridge, its rotors chopping the thin mountain air. From the aircraft below, a charge of explosives detonated, but the blast struck the fuselage without denting it. Instead of damage, the device sparked the aircraft's dormant systems. Lights flared to life, sensors swiveled, and a low-frequency scan rippled across the valley. In an instant, the machine latched onto every heat signature, every movement, and opened fire. Private First Class 81 was the first to react. He dove for a crouch and dragged a wounded comrade out of the line of fire, just as the first salvo slammed into the ground where the soldier had been standing. The squad surged forward, only to come upon a sheer drop that plummeted into a void. A single pulse from the machine's cannon struck the ridge, sending a wave of force that shoved the entire group over the edge. They crashed onto the rocks below, bodies tumbling, limbs cracking, blood splattering the frozen ground. The impact knocked the breath from their lungs and left bruises and fractures in its wake. 81, his helmet fogged with the shock of the fall, glanced up at the chaotic scene and felt the bitter sting of a memory that should have stayed buried. The shouts, the screams, the twisted metal of a tree branch that had pierced a soldier's chest. Afghanistan ripped itself back into his mind, identical in its horror to what now unfolded in front of him. One of the men, designated 7, lay clutching a leg that was twisted beyond normal motion. He whined in pain, his voice thin and raw. Another, designated 57, was already turning a death-gray shade as his breath faded. No one could tell what they had just been attacked by. The device that had erupted from the downed aircraft moved like a predator, silent and relentless. The squad's radio operator, still perched on the ridge, clutching a battered set, was the only link they had with any outside help. 81 knew the transmission line had to be restored. He slipped away from the cluster of wounded men and began the climb back up the stone steps. The path was slick with snow and ice, and midway up he stumbled upon a familiar sight. The lifeless body of a teammate, a comrade whose uniform had been torn clean by the same explosion that had ripped the radio apart. The machine's rogue sensors had found its own reflection in the fallen soldier and, now mobile, stalked the ridge with a metallic whine. It zeroed on the lone figure still alive below, opened a barrel of fire, and erased him in an instant. When 81 reached the ridge, the radio lay in fragments among the snow. Its antenna was snapped like a twig, its circuitry fried. Below, the battered remains of 57 were already gathering darkness. 81 dragged himself back to the group, his breath ragged, and shouted that they had to move. The machine was hunting them. It could shift its weight, roll over stone, and follow the faint trail of blood they left behind. The only chance of survival lay in abandoning the cliff's lip and finding lower ground. They fastened a rope to a sturdy pine that clung to the cliff's face, then lowered the line down the sheer drop. One by one the men descended, their boots chafing against the rough rope, the wind roaring in their ears. When it came time to lower 7, his broken leg buckled under his weight, and 81 crouched at the bottom, ready to catch him. Suddenly his compass spun wildly, the needle flickering as if possessed. The magnetic field of the machine must have been disrupting the instruments. "Move faster!" 81 screamed, his voice raw, as the war machine thundered up the ridge. It barreled into the group's position, unleashing a spray of shrapnel that threw 7 clear of the rope. The machine halted at the cliff's edge, its sensors sweeping the area anew. Every man froze except one, whose wounded leg swung into the scan's focus. The machine fired a burst of high-tech ordnance, pulses that sang through the air like angry insects. By some miracle, the shots missed their mark, splintering the rock instead of the men. The soldiers pulled themselves together, panting, dust and sweat mixing on their faces. They fell into a hushed discussion, each voice low. "It could be Russian," one whispered. "Chinese," another countered. The suspicion hung in the cold air like the mist. 81 stared at 7's blood-streaked uniform and felt his own throat tighten. 7, gritting his teeth against the pain, tried to reassure him. "It's fine, I've got this," he muttered, though his eyes flickered with the same fear that haunted the rest of them. The group fumbled for morphine to ease 7's agony, but the vials had shattered during the fall. "Just do it," 7 shouted, urging 81 to take control of his own fate. 81 pulled the broken bone back into place, twisted the muscle and wrapped it tightly with a piece of torn camouflage. The effort sent a wave of pain through 7, who collapsed, his mind slipping into darkness. "I was right," 81 said, his voice trembling despite his effort to sound confident. "Our coordinates were off. That thing is generating a magnetic field that messes with any compass within a few meters. The real target isn't this ridge, it's the old jet wreckage hidden in the valley." He glanced up the slope, eyes narrowing. "There's a village about 8 kilometers west. The cadres there can get 7 out in shifts. We have to get there now." The only obstacle between them and the village was a river that roared like an angry beast. Its current tore at anything that dared to touch its surface. 81 ordered the men to collect the rope they had used for the cliff to fashion a zip line across the water. He volunteered to be the first swimmer to secure the line on the far bank. He plunged into the icy torrent. The water assaulted his lungs, the current yanked at his limbs, dragging him downstream in a chaotic swirl. For a heartbeat, he thought he would be lost, but his training kicked in. He burst up onto the opposite bank, gasping, his lungs burning. He slammed a knot into the nearest tree, securing the rope. Corporal 15 took the line, fastened his harness, and began to pull 7, still strapped to a stretcher, across. Halfway through the crossing, 7's harness snagged on a protruding rock. The rope slipped from 15's grip, and the weight of the injured soldier threatened to plunge them both into the water. 81 lunged, his fingers clawing at the frayed line, but before he could pull them back, the war machine burst onto the riverbank. Its cannon roared, a concussive blast snapping the zip line in two. The group was hurled into the churning water. The rope that had held 81 caught on a submerged boulder, binding him underwater. He fought against the pull of the current, tore himself free, and surfaced just as the machine's targeting lasers locked onto his exposed silhouette. The river's force hurled him downstream, but the flash of a distant light caught his eye. 7, floating, half submerged, his face pale. 81 dove after him, the current dragging them both toward a sudden drop. The river turned into a waterfall, the water thundering over a sheer cliff. All 4 men, 81, 7, 15, and 44, were swept over the edge, tumbling through the cold spray. 81 clutched at 7's arm, trying to keep his friend from being dragged into the abyss, but the force of the fall knocked him unconscious. When his eyes opened, he found himself gasping on a riverbank, a hand gripping his own wrist. Corporal 60 had emerged from the water earlier. He had been tossed downstream by the same torrent, and after a long drift, had managed to pull himself ashore. He dragged both 81 and 7 onto dry ground, his own clothes drenched and his face a mask of exhaustion. The old radio operator's helmet, a cracked steel shell, bobbed downstream, the identifying number 23 still visible. It floated past them, a grim reminder of the cost of their failed mission. The men pressed onward, the river now a dark ribbon slipping past their boots. Up ahead, half hidden beneath a low shrub, a thin metallic wire stretched across a narrow path, a small flare attached to it. It was part of the cadre's perimeter security. The flare sputtered and ignited as they brushed against the tripwire, casting a brief orange glow that illuminated the devastation ahead. The village that should have been a sanctuary lay in ruins. Charred houses, twisted metal, the wreckage of a radio relay tower reduced to a heap of smoldering steel. The war machine had scarred the settlement, leaving no survivors, no supplies, no safe haven. 81 surveyed the wreckage, his mind racing. The machine had come from higher up the mountains, he concluded, following a line of destruction. 60, still panting, added, "I saw a report on the news about an asteroid that entered the atmosphere a week ago. Something like that, an extraterrestrial object, could explain the tech we're dealing with." A low moan drifted from the remains of a ruined building. A sergeant, gravely wounded, clutched his chest, his breath shallow. As his eyes flickered open for a final moment, he whispered a name, a phrase that cut through the cold night. Then he collapsed, his hand falling limp on the dusty floor. The soldiers fell silent, grief heavy on their shoulders. 81, his voice steadier than he felt, ordered them to move. "We can't stay here," he said. "The machine is still out there, and we have to get 7 to a proper medical station. We need a vehicle." Corporal 15, still bruised and shaken, snapped back at him, anger flashing in his eyes. "The cadre's dead, 81. There's nothing left but to give up for a minute." He pointed at the broken bodies, at the wrecked gear, at the hopelessness that soaked into the soil. 81's own past rose unbidden, a vortex of regret. He thought of his own base, of a younger brother who had been waiting for his return. The memory of a medal that had been placed on his chest after a day that had turned to ash, of the sound of a distant gunshot that had silenced his brother's final breath. "I never made it back," he muttered, his voice cracking. "I fell 100 yards short. My brother died because I couldn't get him across the line. They gave me a medal for that day. I carry that weight every time I step forward." He looked at his comrades, seeing their faces lit by the waning fire of the flare. "It's not about us anymore," he said, the words steadying him. "It's about getting 7 to a field hospital and warning everyone that whatever that thing is, it's coming." The resolve in his voice turned the ragged group into a single, purposeful unit. Nearby, half buried in mud, lay a Soviet-era T-55 tank, its tracks jammed in the soft earth. The engine coughed but would not turn. 15, who had been a mechanic before the war, knelt and fumbled with the exposed gears, his hands moving with practiced ease. After a few tense minutes, he managed to clear the jam, depressurize the fuel line, and fire up the engine. The tank rumbled to life, its hull trembling as the turret rotated. The men, exhausted and covered in grime, clambered inside. 44, ever the opportunist, rummaged through the storage compartment and unearthed a stash of canned rations. They began loading 7 onto the back of the tank, placing a field stretcher beneath his injured leg, securing him with a hastily tied rope. As they pushed the heavy vehicle toward a makeshift path, the tripwire flare, still smoldering, burst, its bright flash revealing the silhouette of the war machine advancing through the ruins. Its massive tread wheels crunched over broken stone as it closed the distance. The tank's gunner, Corporal 15, scrambled for ammunition. He darted back to the edge of the ruined village, his boots kicking up dust, and hoisted crates of shells onto the tank's side. The war machine, now within range, unleashed a barrage of high-frequency projectiles that peppered the tank's armor. The first round struck the side, sending a spray of shrapnel across the interior. The second penetrated near the engine compartment, blowing a small disc of metal into the floor. The men inside grunted and held fast, but the assault continued, the machine's cannons roaring like a living beast. The tank responded, firing the newly loaded shells in a desperate volley. The shots rang out, but the machine's hull seemed to absorb the impact, the rounds, ricocheting harmlessly off its alien alloy. The war machine retaliated with a series of explosives that detonated along the road, blasting the very ground beneath the tank's tracks. The road crumbled, a gaping chasm opening where the path had once been. The tank surged forward, its massive weight carrying it over the broken surface, and then, without warning, slid down the hillside, its treads grinding against loose rock. The vehicle skidded to a halt at the bottom of the slope, the engine sputtering, the turret locked in place. Smoke curled from its gun barrel, and the crew, bruised and bloodied, clambered from the hatch. The war machine loomed behind them, its sensors still sweeping, its weapons primed. It let out a low, humming sound that seemed to vibrate the very air. 81, clutching a soaked rope, surveyed the devastated scene. The valley stretched out, the mountains far behind them, and the war machine, an eerie silhouette against the night sky, stood as a dark sentinel. He turned to his men, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of the flare, and said, "We have to keep moving. The only way out is to head north, toward the ridge where the old jet crash site is. If we can destroy that wreck, maybe we can cut off whatever signal is drawing this thing here." The men nodded, their resolve hardened by loss, by pain, by the memory of friends who would not live to see the sunrise. They gathered the remaining supplies, fashioned a makeshift stretcher for 7, and began the arduous trek up the broken slope, each step echoing with the distant whir of the machine that still hunted them. In the distance, the faint outline of the old jet lay half buried beneath snow and rock. The promise of a final stand, of a chance to disrupt the alien signal, flickered in the darkness like a beacon. The soldiers pressed forward, every breath a reminder that survival was not a matter of luck alone, but of the stubborn will to keep moving, even when every step felt like a step toward oblivion. The war machine was not an obvious presence on the ridge. It lay concealed beneath a thicket of twisted steel and shattered rock, waiting for the moment when the soldiers would be close enough to feel its weight. When it finally emerged, it rolled forward like a metallic beast, its armor plates glinting in the dim light before it slammed into the front of the tank. The sudden impact sent the vehicle shuddering, and a cascade of alarms rang out as the crew scrambled for their weapons. Rookie 81 was the first to hear the scream of the machine's cannons. He vaulted from his seat, lunged for the rifle that lay tucked inside the tank's turret, and hurled a burst of fire toward the advancing enemy. The shots clanged harmlessly off the machine's reinforced hull, the projectiles bouncing away as if struck by an invisible shield. In the chaos, the metal of a shattered shell tore across the floor, catching the arm of 109 and slicing it cleanly at the wrist. Blood spurted, and the soldier's hand fell limp onto the cold steel. The war machine's hydraulic jaws snapped shut around the tank, teeth of steel grinding into the armor like a saw through wood. Piece by piece, the hull gave way, rivets flying, bulkheads collapsing. The explosions that followed threw splinters of metal and shrapnel into the air, and the sound of tearing steel was deafening. 7, who had been positioned at the rear, was thrown from his seat as the vehicle disintegrated. He hit the ground hard, a cloud of dust rising around him, and lay motionless for an instant before coughing up blood. 81 lunged forward, his boots sinking into the muddied earth, and grabbed 7's jacket. The grip was firm at first, then the tremor of the explosion that had ripped through the tank shook them both, and the rope of his hand slipped. As he tried to steady himself, a massive rock formation rumbled nearby. The war machine's massive forearm slammed into the stone, crushing it and sending a cascade of jagged boulders down onto the wreckage. The debris created a temporary shield, burying part of the machine under a tomb of rock. "Stop the tank!" 81 shouted into the howling wind, his voice cracking. He expected to hear the reply of 44, the driver who had always kept a steady hand on the controls, but the seat was empty. 44's body lay slack, his eyes staring into the void. The tank's engine sputtered, coughed, and then went silent, the once-alive behemoth reduced to a heap of twisted steel. Memory swallowed 81 whole. He was back in Afghanistan, the desert heat pressing down on his shoulders, the sand swirling there through his boots. He could see the base he had been defending, the flags flapping limp and the silhouette of his brother, his hands already stained with dust. His brother's voice, rough and urgent, echoed in his mind. "Don't quit." The image of his own body collapsing just short of the perimeter, the world tilting, and his brother's face disappearing behind a wall of smoke burned brighter than any fight he had faced since. He forced those images away and turned his gaze back to the wreckage. Every teammate he had known, every laugh shared in the barracks, every promise made over a cold mess hall tray. They were gone. The battlefield was silent except for the soft hiss of steam escaping the war machine's vents. The creature lay half buried, a dark, humming presence that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. 81 knelt among the broken armor and began to dig with his hands, his fingers scraping through bone-white dust. He uncovered only a fragment of the machine, a single exposed conduit that hissed faintly. The rest of the device had already slipped free, hovering a short distance away, its surface flickering with alien symbols that glowed like fireflies against the night sky. Signals shot upward, invisible threads of communication that crackled in the cold air. The machine was listening, transmitting, calculating. A thud of metal announced Seven's presence. He lay breathing, his chest rising and falling with shallow, ragged gasps. Small explosions popped around the rim of the wreck, each one a reminder that the war machine was still scanning, still learning. Its sensors whirred, a soft mechanical whine that grew louder as it zeroed in on the duo. Desperation surged through 81. He wrapped his arms around Seven, hoisted him onto his shoulders, and bolted toward the slope that rose behind the wreck. Rain hammered the ground, turning the earth into slick mud that sucked at his boots. He felt the weight of his comrade shift as the soaked ground stole his grip. Seven slipped, his body tumbling down the slope in a flurry of mud and blood. 81 lunged, caught a hand, pulled the wounded soldier back up, and started the climb again. He repeated the frantic ascent, each step a battle against gravity and the cold that seeped through his skin. Time seemed to fold in on itself, the minutes stretching into an eternity, his lungs burning with each gasp of rain-sodden air. At last they reached a small plateau, the sky a thin veil of overcast gray. The rain fell in sheets, turning the world into a blur of sound and motion. Their mission timer flashed red on 81's wristwatch. The Ranger objective was slipping away, the deadline closing like a fist. Exhaustion gnawed at his muscles, his vision tunneled, and he collapsed beside Seven, the mud seeping into his uniform. Tears welled, hot and bitter, spilling over his cheeks as he tried to choke them back. "Listen," Seven rasped, his voice hoarse but steady. "I recognized you the moment we boarded that bus. I was with an air assault unit, a loudmouth private who wore the same tattoo you have. I knew your brother. I've tried to tell you that ever since." The confession landed like a stone in the tumult of his mind. 81 had been running toward a finish line he imagined would bring his brother peace, hoping that crossing it could quiet the relentless night. Seven's words broke the hold that grief had over him. "You never gave up," Seven continued, his breath shallow. "That's not failure. That's what it means to be a Ranger." As he spoke, the war machine's scanning beam swept across the plateau, a thin line of cold light that paused, then sharpened, locking onto their forms. The metallic behemoth had found them. A wry smile flickered on 81's lips despite the pain. "My brother would have just poured stop leak into this thing," he joked, trying to stave off the terror. In that instant, a hiss of steam rose from the machine's vents, the sound sharp as a kettle about to blow. An idea sparked in his mind like a flare in the darkness. He set Seven down behind a jagged outcrop, covering him with a battered tarp as best he could, then slipped away toward a nearby quarry. A forgotten pit of stone and steel that loomed like a wounded animal waiting for relief. The quarry was a maze of concrete slabs, rusted cranes, and abandoned conveyor belts. Flickering fluorescent lights, long out of use, sputtered to life as he brushed past, casting pale halos over the dust. At the heart of the quarry stood a massive cone crusher, its iron teeth opening and closing in a silent rhythm. Nearby lay a control panel, the buttons dulled by time, and a remote that still hummed with dormant power. He scavenged a length of pipe and an old crane, dragging them to the center of the pit. Explosives, improvised charges patched together from salvaged ordnance, were tucked beneath the foundation of the crusher. The war machine hovered above the quarry, its sensors whirring, its neon veins pulsing as it tried to map the terrain. 81 lifted the flare gun from the broken ammunition crate, the metal cold in his hands, and aimed at the sky. He fired, the flare arching bright and fierce, a comet of red that cut through the rain and drew the machine's attention like a moth to flame. The beast surged forward, its massive limbs pounding the earth as it descended upon the quarry. The ground trembled, and the scanner swept the whole area, trying to locate any sign of life. When the machine's massive foot pressed onto the pit's edge, the hidden charges detonated with a thunderous roar. Shrapnel and stone erupted, burying the machine's lower chassis in a cascade of crushing weight. From the crane's hook, 81 hoisted a massive girdle of steel and slammed it onto the war machine's hull, pinning it against the cone crusher. The crusher's rotating teeth ground into the machine's vent ports, turning metal and rock into a fine dust that choked the metallic breathing tubes. Steam hissed, then sputtered as pressure built inside the beast. The machine's servos strained, its artificial limbs jerking violently, trying to dislodge the crushing weight. The war machine fought back, its hydraulic arms swinging, sending bolts of energy toward the crane. 81 gripped his rifle, firing bursts into the exposed panels, the rounds sparking against alloy. He crushed the crane's base, driving the crusher's teeth deeper into the vent system. The vents became clogged, a plug of stone and metal that sealed the beast's lifeblood. Heat built to a searing point, the internal furnace of the machine roaring with unchecked power. Finally, the pressure could no longer be contained. A fissure opened across the chest of the war machine, steam exploding outward in a blinding flash. The beast's core, a pulsating sphere of alien energy, cracked, dark smoke curling from the wound. The creature let out a final, mournful whine, a dying sound that echoed across the quiet quarry, then fell silent. Shrapnel and debris rained down, scattering across the ground like dead leaves. The explosion sent shockwaves through the valley, the air trembling with the echo of the machine's end. 81 stumbled away, his boots slick with rain and blood, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He turned back to see the machine's carcass smoldering, a twisted sculpture of metal and ash. The next morning, the sky was a bruised violet, the storm having passed, leaving a cool, crisp air that smelled of wet earth and burned circuitry. 81 lifted 7 onto his shoulders, the wounded soldier's weight a familiar burden that no longer felt foreign. Together they walked the shattered path back toward the base, each step a testament to endurance, each breath a vow that they would not let the fallen be forgotten. When they emerged onto the fortified compound, the scene was a tableau of frantic activity. Medics rushing to treat the wounded, commanders barking orders, and soldiers staring in stunned silence at the tale that had unfolded just beyond the perimeter. Sergeant Major Donovan, a grizzled veteran whose eyes had seen too many battles, approached 81 with a grave expression. "The cost of defending this outpost was half a battalion," Donovan said, his voice low but steady. "There are dozens more of those machines out there, ripping through the sky like meteors that have split into endless pods. The world is aligning against us, every nation, every army, every citizen. Yet those things do not die easily. How did you take one down with nothing but a quarry and sheer will?" 81 looked into the sergeant's eyes, the weight of his experiences pressing down like a mantle. He spoke slowly, describing the makeshift weapons, the improvised trap, the way the machine's own sensors had been turned against it, the crushing pressure of the crusher's teeth, and the final seal that had forced its heart to explode. He narrated not as a soldier, but as a man who had been forced to become a maker of solutions in the midst of chaos. The sergeant nodded, his face softening. "Your knowledge will save lives," he said, placing a ranger tab upon 81's chest. "If you have the strength, the other rangers would gladly hear what you have learned." Without a moment's hesitation, 81 stepped forward, his voice rising above the din of the base. He spoke of duty, of sacrifice, of the bond that held them together, even when the world seemed intent on tearing it apart. He recalled the faces of those lost, the echo of his brother's words, and the unbreakable resolve that burned within every ranger. The soldiers around him stood a little taller, clenched their fists, and let his words ignite a fire in their chests. When his speech ended, the base erupted in a chorus of resolute cheers. The rangers gathered, forming a line that stretched across the courtyard, each man and woman equipped with the knowledge of how to use the terrain, the tools at hand, and the ingenuity that had saved 2 men that day. 81, still cradling the memory of his brother, turned to face the horizon where distant silhouettes of war machines flickered against the sunrise. The battle was far from over.